Well, good afternoon if you are on the East Coast of North America or somewhere in South America. Good evening if you are in Europe. Guten Abend if you're in Dresden, Germany. Hello overnight in every other part of the world, Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Islands. I know we have viewers everywhere. I'm Fred Plotkin. Today is Friday, so this must be Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Idagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Idagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. I try every Friday to present people who are interesting, fascinating, fun, from whom we can learn and with whom I can have a good conversation. And my guest today fulfills every one of those boxes to be checked and much more. His name is Michael Hurshell, who joins us today from Dresden in Germany. Hello, good Friday evening in Dresden. Hello, Michael.
Good evening, Fred. Lovely to be here.
Michael is many things. He's a conductor, a very fine conductor. He's also a professor of conducting. Some people can do it and teach it. Some people can just teach it. Some people can just do it. Michael is both. He's the president of the Jüdische Gemeinde zu Dresden, the music director of the new Jewish, I'll say it in English, you can say it in German, Chamber Philharmonic of Dresden. You curated a permanent multimedia exhibit about Richard Wagner in Pirna, a town just outside of Dresden. We're going to talk about that. It's a wonderful installation. And you have contributed richly to the musical life of Dresden and therefore of Germany and therefore the world, and also to the maintenance, to the rehabilitation, the rediscovery of Jewish composers who were German or perhaps not, whose works vanished due to war, history, anti-Semitism, Nazism. But you have reconstructed, in effect, all of that in a new, relatively new synagogue in Dresden. Would you talk first about the place where you work? In other words, that synagogue, you were also at a university, but for now, I mean, the musical life of the synagogue and your role in it.
The synagogue was opened in 2001, which was a few years before I got here, actually 1 year before I started teaching here. And some friends of mine and I decided that there needed to be a revival of some forgotten Jewish composers, some of whom are very familiar to the American audiences because they became great names in Hollywood, Korngold, Roja, Waxman, and so on. And so a chamber orchestra was formed. It's been 14 years. And our principal venue when performing in Dresden is the synagogue. So we are part of the cultural offerings. The German audiences now come to our concerts rarely, but it took them a while to get used to the fact that a synagogue was just as regular a place for concerts as a church might be. Mm-hmm. Because to many of them, of course, the synagogue was still rather an exotic place. But we're getting them used to it, and because the synagogue has actually lovely acoustics for the repertoire that we do, I think more and more people have been coming and seeing the synagogue for the first time when they come to hear us play there.
But it is also a functioning synagogue for the Jewish community of Dresden and Saxony.
Well, you mentioned the title in German, which not everyone might have understood. I was elected president of the Jewish community of Dresden last year, to my own unending surprise, because it's like most of the Jewish communities in Germany these days, it's 95, 96, 97% ex-Soviets who came in the 90s and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a few Germans, and not a very large American contingent, maybe one. and that I should be elected was a big surprise. And it is a very, very interesting environment to work in because there are many, many challenges going on. The rising right in Europe, including Germany, and various pressures and questions of security and so on and so on. So there is, it does take up probably more of my time than I had anticipated, but it's a fascinating work.
Here's a question I've never thought to ask anyone, either Jewish, non-Jewish, rabbi, or conductor, or cantor for that matter, cantor being the person who sings in the synagogue a lot of the liturgical music. The Jewish tradition is many things, one of them being a love of scholarship, analysis, thorough debate, study, whether it's the Torah, or other texts that are read and analyzed for world history and consequence for the Jews and so on. I think I can make a pretty good case that a conductor does the same thing with a musical score.
Indeed.
And do you find, you're not a rabbi, but you are part of this tradition, that similar engagement with text and ideas happens from words than does notes and perhaps music, words in the score? How does your mind, well, let's just talk about your mind, when you engage with these different things, which are at their base fascinating testaments to world history and culture, but also ask for analysis and interpretation by the individual looking at them, do you ever notice similarities in the way you approach a musical score and a liturgical text or something from the Torah?
Well, I would say that my basic approach to many different disciplines, and I think in this we are quite similar, I am after, first and foremost, exacting the most pleasure from information, emotional content, and of course, communicating it to others. And that's whether we're analyzing a text of some kind or whether we're interpreting a piece of music. So the sort of the final payoff is always this enables you to experience a richness and a pleasure that comes from the meeting of ideas and so on and so on. So that is that one can certainly apply to both music and to texts of various kinds. Since I'm also engaged in musicology because of reconstructing some of the scores that we don't have printed, but only in manuscript form. And yes, the sort of the Jewish idea that a Torah was printed with very large margins so that everybody could put their commentaries in, not just what Rashi said, but what people 200 years later said about his and so on. And so usually the margins in a score are fairly narrow, but one does make lots of annotations and put things in there that occur to one as one is sort of delving into it. And so that is certainly one way. I'm sure that there are many musicians who approach it from a totally different perspective, but in my case, that was a correct assumption on your part.
I will say that one of the most thrilling experiences I've ever had in my life was I have had through the years access to archives such as the Metropolitan Opera, but also the New York Philharmonic. And many people don't know that Dvorak's Symphony No. 9, the Symphony from the New World, was written for the New York Philharmonic and premiered at Carnegie Hall. And his score is there in the archive of the New York Philharmonic, as are other copies of that score with notations by conductors who came through in all the years after and conducted this very popular work. Similarly, the New York Philharmonic in particular has a long link to Gustav Mahler. And Mahler conducted the New York Philharmonic. He conducted some of his symphonies there. Leonard Bernstein, who was music director for many years, became an advocate for Mahler's work because actually it had been eclipsed for a while and had to be brought back by Bernstein and others. And Bernstein's markings in his score are fascinating because I look at them and I look at Mahler's original score and his occasional markings. And then you see what Bernstein read in the Mahler and created on his own, which is not to say he deviated from Mahler, but he drew ideas from Mahler. And I'm bringing this up not because everybody here is Jewish, but Mahler was of Jewish origin. Bernstein, although very progressive politically, had a strong Jewish identity. His father was quite religious, and he wrote a Kaddish symphony, Kaddish being a prayer for the dead, his
The
third
third, yes.
symphony, and other works that extracted from the Jewish persona, the Jewish approach, if one can generalize, to ideas. And I'm not saying in any way that Bernstein looked at Mahler's symphonies as Jewish symphonies. I don't think they are at all. But Mahler said, and I'm paraphrasing, that the symphony is the world. Each symphony is the world. And Bernstein would look at those and conduct them with that in mind. And so to me, one of my great pleasures, and I'm fortunate that I can do it because not everyone has access to these precious scores, is to go look at the scores that first composers wrote and labored over, but then that conductors went and conducted. Have you done that in studying different music, and are there particular conductors you've been inspired by?
Well, let's stick to Bernstein for a moment. One piece of work of his that had a great influence on me was when he was advocating something that most other conductors wouldn't even touch with a 10-foot baton, namely the Mahler revisions of the Schumann symphonies. And even though, of course, Bernstein did not himself perform the reorchestrations that Mahler did, because we've gotten away from that, but the tempo fluctuations. And when I was studying conducting in Vienna, and Bernstein was in Vienna doing all the Schumann symphonies of the Musikverein, and I went and heard, for example, the Fourth Symphony, and there were just rubati in there that took my breath away. And when I started conducting Schumann symphonies some years later, I tried that out, and I found it very, very fulfilling and interesting. So yes, there are important
Would you just tell us what Mahler, just tell us what Mahler was intending to do with these, let's call it revisions?
Well, it was the opinion in the 19th century that Schumann was just a very inexperienced and poor orchestrator, and that he wrote things in registers for, let's take the violin solo in the slow movement of the Fourth Symphony, that are in such a low register that the violinists just despair when they have to play it because it's so hard to be heard. But later on, people thought, well, the Schumann symphonies are not being performed enough. They're not thought of well enough. And Mahler, of course, was a wonderful and energetic advocate of music, which he felt was not being performed enough. And I mean, he did that in a lot of different ways. He would take chamber music, which wasn't performed in concerts back then. At the end of the 19th century, it was a private affair for musicians playing. But he took the Quartetto Serioso by Beethoven and the Opus 131 and performed them with 60 or 70 string players, just so that concert audiences would hear these works. And we'll get later back to why I am a particular admirer of that idea that you're allowed to do that. But again, Bernstein being such a significant interpreter, and very interesting what he did with the Mahler symphonies. And of course, he was one of the, there are essentially two. In the States, we basically say he put Mahler back in the concert halls. I would say that over here in Europe, a little bit earlier, Mengelberg started doing that in the 1920s. And then later on in the 1960s, about the same time that Bernstein was making his recordings, Bernhard Haitink was also doing a complete cycle in Amsterdam. And so between the Haitink and the Bernstein records, which were all over, that's what really got it. And now, of course, every regional orchestra with more than 50 players tries to play Mahler. And he said his time would come, and he was right.
Are there other scores that you've looked at that had markings of conductors, and were you influenced or fascinated or challenged by any of those?
Whenever I had a chance to look at something, I mean, a lot of conductors keep their scores kind of in a vault because they don't, it's not because they're afraid somebody will steal something, but because it's very private. It's kind of like opening up your insides. And so it's not as if everybody has their marked up scores lying around for inspection. I wanted to say, when you just mentioned a moment ago that you had access to these various archives, when I was at college, a friend of mine worked for one trimester, I guess it was then. He was at a different university, at the Pierpont Morgan.
In New York.
He invited me to go there with him one day, and we had access to everything.
Mm-hmm.
We walked into the climatized music vault, and I had Brahms' Second Symphony manuscript in my hands and Strauss' Death and Transfiguration. Those were amazing moments for me. I mean, Morgan is mostly famous more for collecting, Dickens and all kinds of poetry and so on. But the music collection is just hair-raising. And so that was the first time that I had such manuscripts in my hands, and it was very, very a very interesting experience. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, in the final analysis, it's really the score itself, what the composer decided to put on paper, that's still the most important thing. And what conductors put into their scores, what any conductor thinks is important for his own interpretation or to remind him when he's performing or whatever, is, I think, most of the time, simply the conductor's way of trying to bring out what he thinks the composer meant. Because not everything is written in. Mahler's kind of an exception, because Mahler did give an incredible, wonderful amount of instructions, especially in the form of negative instructions. Niemals eilen, never rush this passage, but because he was such a wonderful conductor himself and could already imagine what people would do if they ever performed his music. But most other, if it's Beethoven or Brahms or any of the other canon or anything earlier than that, of course, there isn't much there besides the pitches and sort of basic dynamic instructions and some phrasing. So you have to, if you want to get into the weeds and into the depth of this stuff, then you have to think about it and make some decisions. Mm-hmm. And I think the markings, at least in my case, are there to, even though by the time you're performing, you're not looking at the score that much, or if you're even using one. So I too sometimes won't use one, but it's really just to remind you, don't forget that this is about to happen, or don't forget to prevent what might go. And if people who start writing poetry into their orchestral score, or start evoking, literary quotes or whatever, that's a personal thing. It has not so much to do with how they interpret that. That's more sort of philosophizing or thinking about. So, and of course, many conductors, Schulte was one who, when he was already an old man, started buying all new scores because he was going to, do another cycle of Shostakovich or whatever it was. And he said, I got to get rid of all this old stuff that you can't see anything anymore. I got to start fresh, right? So
I remember when he died, because he died in Italy, and I have a little place in Italy, and I was not too far away from where that happened. Huh. He died just days after Princess Diana and Mother Teresa. And because the whole world was focused on, understandably, on the death of Princess Diana, and to a lesser degree, but significant, on Mother Teresa, I felt that one of the greatest conductors of all time was basically ignored, because, Schulte had great timing, but not with that.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that you are also an admirer of Schulte. There's quite a sort of a division in the music world there, especially when you talk to orchestras. There are orchestra musicians who had the greatest reverence for him, and then there were orchestra musicians who just loathed him.
Why?
I'm not even talking about personality now. We're talking just about the gestures themselves, and obviously, I'm sure that you also. We all have those old recordings that he started making in the late 50s, and they're just fabulous. But he himself said in a number of interviews that for many years, when he would go and record with the Vienna Philharmonic, which are some of the greatest recordings he made, but his favorite road in Vienna was the road to the airport, because it was so stressful and filled with altercations. So that to me is remarkable, though. Some of the greatest recording legacy of the 20th century evolved out of a very difficult working relationship, as it appears.
Well, many of his recordings are available on the Adagio catalog, and people who are younger than we are don't necessarily know that there was a time when recording companies would sign up superstar conductors and pianists and singers, and they would have almost an exclusive contract with that company, kind of like old Hollywood studios. Mm-hmm. That if Betty Davis was at Warner Brothers, she had to be lent out on a special arrangement.
If Selznick wanted her, then he had to pay through the nose.
Yes. And Schulte was London Decca, and Bernstein was Columbia, CBS, Sony, whatever you want to call it. And Herbert von Karajan was basically Deutsche Grammophon. And a Dutch label was Philips, and they had certain other conductors. And Philips had Montserrat Caballé and Jose Carreras, and London Decca had Luciano Pavarotti and Joan Sutherland.
Among others, right.
Among others, and DG had Plácido Domingo. That's how it worked. And so that all of these people recorded the entire canon with their respective companies, often several times. So that we would talk about that we would listen to the Schulte, the Bernstein, the Karajan, just to name three, because at the same time they would all put out Brahms sets and Beethoven sets and New Tristan and Isoldes and so forth. And yes, they were done in the recording studio, and yes, with the operas, they were done with the singers available for these different companies. But it's a remarkable luxury that they had then. And part of why we can talk about those three, Karajan, Bernstein, Schulte, is that they were contemporaries and they were somewhat competitive. I'm sure they were admiring of one another, but very competitive. And each worked with the great orchestras and wanted to work with the great singers. And they all wanted Christa Ludwig, for example, and got her. But the mindset was different, I think, in terms of one of the reasons why these things were produced. Yes, there was an audience to buy them, but also they enshrined the conductors.
They enshrined conductors, they enshrined soloists, instrumentalists, and there was a prestige, a recognized prestige, because no single company ever made all that much money putting out opera recordings, right? They're so expensive to make, or symphony cycles for that matter. But they recognized that they had to make their money elsewhere, and that it was very prestigious. I mean, I'm sure you're probably aware of this, but I only found this out fairly recently, a few years ago. The single most sold record album of all time is Schulte's Ring.
Yeah.
Has outsold everything. So some record companies maybe then recognized, actually, this is a valuable property, we can. But unfortunately today, first of all, we don't have that system anymore, what you called sort of like the studio system, which is really too bad. And as you said, it's luckily for us because we then have all these different interpretations to compare. Sometimes, I mean, Karajan, of course, being as influential, it wasn't just with Deutsche Grammophon. He also made a lot of EMI recordings in London with the Philharmonia, some of which are some of his best recordings here. So I still think the old mono Hansel and Gretel is still the greatest one. There's just a question today on, how it is that recordings get funded and why companies decide to make them. And of course, now if they're going to make something commercial, then they will probably want to make a DVD rather than just an audio recording, which I certainly understand that that's a different market, but it is also the same reason I'm sorry that they don't have radio plays anymore, and that everything is, because the mind doesn't get to be quite as active once the pictures are provided, right?
When I teach opera, I teach only with audio, and I ask the person to become his or her own stage director of the mind, so that I want you to hear music and have a suggestion of what might be happening on the stage, what colors there are. Schulte once said that the scenery of an opera should look like what the music sounds like.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
But you might remember that Shaw once said the greatest and most talented painter at an opera house cannot really do justice to the music, and Shaw said actually people who go to the opera already have it all in their minds, and people who don't have the imagination to have it in their minds shouldn't go to the opera, and usually don't go anyway. So and because he was talking about his favorite way of hearing the Ring, which was to go into the box, take a second chair, put his feet up and close his eyes. Mm-hmm. So this is a question, of course, today where stage directors are as influential as they became later on. That's no longer a subject. But maybe just one tidbit of Dresden history. I have many music lover friends here, my age or slightly older, who still speak in tones of awe of their very favorite performance of The Ring, which was when Janowski performed it in concert before recording it.
Mm-hmm.
They did a complete Ring in concert, and they said it was the most exciting Ring they ever heard.
Well, they probably came to that with a knowledge of the story, and they were not necessarily reading titles.
Of course.
And they know that this is where the sword is pulled out of the tree, and this is where the sword stabs Fafner, and we know all that if we know these stories. But one of my goals, and I know yours, is to bring people into this art form who may feel intimidated. And that's why I have conversations with people such as you in front of an audience, so that we can create these stimuli. I want to go back about 6 topics to Robert Schumann.
Yes.
Because it's interesting what you were saying to me, and I can understand why he was perceived as not being a great orchestrator compared to Berlioz, Beethoven, some of the others at that time. And yet, there are people, for conductors and musicians, I mean, for whom he is the most sublime. And I'm not talking about the vocal music, because I certainly get that, but his symphonic music. And I'll give you an example. I've had the great honor and pleasure to know and work with many conductors and learn from them, especially. That's, to me, the great thrill. 3 more than anyone else: Bernstein, Claudio Abbado, and James Levine, in that order of knowing them. And they're all gone now, unfortunately. And if I had to pick one, I don't want to have to pick one, but it would be Claudio Abbado, was my conductor god. And the last thing that he was doing as he lay dying was studying or reading the score of the Third Symphony by Robert Schumann, and in fact was buried with that score. What can you tell us about the Third Symphony of Robert Schumann that may have been so special? Period.
Well, I actually had not heard that about that score being the last score that he had in his hands. I adore the Rheinische Symphony. I in particular the slow 4th movement, feierlich, so solemnly, I guess would be the English translation, which is a very interesting word for a tempo, right? That's not a speed, that's a mindset, a philosophy. And it is one of his most contrapuntal, and at the same time, one of the most gorgeously scored, from the trombone chorale at the beginning through. So I love the Schumann symphonies, and I certainly, what you said, obviously his contemporaries, there was Berlioz, and even before Berlioz, there was Weber, and the Beethoven scores were getting better and better known. And so when he wrote the Spring Symphony, he wasn't all that experienced yet. It was still a very exciting piece. But by the time we get to the third, which is of course the last one, because the order is right, the one that's 4 is actually 2. There's just such a wealth of expression, and because there's so much life and joy in some of the other movements, this slow one, which of course has the story, right, that he apparently the idea came to him when he was watching the enthronement of an archbishop in Cologne, and Cologne of course is one of the biggest cathedrals ever built, and it's, one can only imagine a huge procession and incense everywhere, and the solemnity, and just the pageantry, and the sort of the atmosphere, not in itself, but because that it inspired in him this incredible piece. And when in fact I heard Bernstein do it in Vienna, that's also one of the kind of anecdotal things. There was a gorgeous performance, followed as an encore. They did the Academic Festival Overture, and Bernstein came out on stage and then had to stand there because he'd forgotten that they had to go and get the big side drum and the triangle because they weren't planning on playing it. And then he went out to tremendous applause, and then he came back on, and this of course was all being recorded on film, right, for the laser discs, and suddenly feierlich, the fourth movement, began again. And for one wild moment, we all thought, oh my God, we're going to get to hear that again. And his interpretation of that movement is, I think, by far the slowest I've ever heard, and my favorite one, therefore. But no, it was because something had happened when they did it during the concert, and they just needed that first oomph.
Retake, yeah.
So he conducted like a bar, and then he left again, and it was like everyone was like, oh. So anyway, so I have very, very fond memories of that, and I adore the movement, and I actually use it quite a lot to teach also, because there's so many interesting things going on for conducting class in counterpoint and instrumentation and so on.
Well, that was actually my next question. I'm just going to say that parenthetically, when you and I conclude our conversation, I'm going straight to Adagio and looking up Schumann Third Symphony with different interpretations, and I will listen, and then I'll chat with you about this.
Okay.
But the next question was relating to what you just brought up. When you teach, how does one teach conducting? Where do you start? And then, because there's the mental part, but there's the physical part. And then there's the, how do I call it, authoritative business part.
Thank heavens that is not my job. But I have to say this, a wise person once remarked that there are three ways to learn about conducting. The definitely by far most effective and by far the best way is to do it. Learning by doing. Conducting is really a learning by doing profession. Then in second place, already quite a long way off, is to attend the rehearsals of a really competent conductor and see what the person is doing during rehearsal when all the work gets done. And long way behind that, just behind the horizon, is taking classes in conducting, because there are things you can and cannot teach. Whether someone is, as they would say in German, gestisch begabt, in other words, has a natural freedom of movement and coordination, which enable them to make gestures which are helpful. And that's the key word. The key word is not that will floor the audience or that will make the photographers go wild, but that will actually help the players play together and play, stylistically in the right way. And so there's that. Some people have are born with a greater capability for that. Then there's the question of how a young musician's mind has been trained previously in a very old-fashioned European way. I force everybody to play the piano in my conducting classes, even those who are, come there as violinists or flautists or whatever, because we play all the symphonic repertoire that we're doing, in four-hand piano versions when we're going through the scores. And there are actually conducting teachers who will sit by themselves at the piano and play. But of course, if they do that, then the orchestra is always together. It doesn't really count. If you want to see whether an upbeat really works, it's much better to have two grand pianos, which we have in the conducting rooms, have two people playing the four-hand arrangement at one and two people playing the four-hand arrangement on the other. And if they can come in together, you've already gotten a long way. So just teaching the upbeat is so basic. So it's the question, are they keyboard players? Aren't they keyboard players? If they are keyboard players, have they tried to get into a score via the keyboard? In other words, sitting down and looking, what are the winds doing? What are the brass doing, and so on. So there's that. There's also that, which also is a matter of whether a student has the ambition, shall we say, or the drive to take that time to do those things and to try and explore. And the keyboard is just a good way of exploring. So those who can't work on the keyboard are at a disadvantage. But that's also sort of a very traditional European approach to conducting, because it's the opera house in Europe, as you know, the opera house in Europe and the symphony orchestra in America. And the opera house means you have to work with the singers and coach with them and play stage rehearsals. And so playing the piano is very, very important.
That's really how Schulte began in Frankfurt in Switzerland, I believe. That he played.
Well, he actually began in Budapest, but only got to
Budapest. But I mean, when he left
Budapest, he had to leave.
Yes, he did have to leave. But I meant his first bigger jobs. I know that he had a period.
Well, Munich was the first really big job before Frankfurt even, and it was his autobiography is wonderful. I recommend it to everyone who's interested in the subject. It's quite wonderful. We don't have to elaborate anymore. He describes it also wonderfully. But the idea that he did say something also in one of his late interviews in German on German television, Austrian television, in fact, if I remember, when he was asked about why, we're going off the course now, but just because I just remember this now,
right.
Why is it that stage directors have become so powerful, too powerful in his opinion, because he thought many stage directors have no regard for the music and are raping every opera that they put on stage. And he said, it's because the conductors have become so weak. It's not the stage director's fault, it's the conductor's fault, because, and the main reason he said is because not enough conductors are trained from the piano upwards, but come in from the side sort of without knowing how a theater works and how all that happens. And he said, he used an expression in German, he said, if this continues, es wird ganz bitter böse enden, it will end in a very bitter and bad way, because we're going to wind up with a whole continent of theaters which are exclusively run by stage directors, just because the conductors are not strong enough. So he had some very decided opinions. And of course, I have worked with different kinds of stage directors, and there's nothing wrong with having a modern and new interpretation of something visually, as long as what you said before, as long as what you see is connected to what you hear and doesn't disregard it.
Well, as you know, my training, my background in opera was in stage direction and production. And I worked with Zeffirelli, and I worked with Giorgio Strehler, especially, and a lot of the Italians and a few others. And all of them, no matter how decorative or how over the top they could be in the case of Zeffirelli, knew that the music came first, and that our knowledge about the characters and about their intentions was described in the music even more than the words, and that you had to get a sense of what the music was saying so that you as a conductor find things in the score. I as a stage director may find things in the score if I'm doing my job properly. And I feel, unfortunately, that many modern stage directors come to this from another area of theater or film or television and create visual imagery and find similarities between the plot and contemporary life, let's say. And that's not opera. That is a hybrid of other things. And I'm not criticizing all modern productions, because they're excellent modern productions.
There are also good ones, but you said the important, I mean, first of all, the stage directors that you worked with and that you trained with, of course, were marvelous. I mean, Zeffirelli and Strehler alone, because also, unlike a lot of today's directors, I'm afraid, unlike them and unlike you, I mean, you and they could read a score. So way too many stage directors today, if as you say, they come from film or they come from the spoken theater, and they just haven't been trained, so they are kind of winging it and unable to really get. But as you say, so much, the character is revealed in the music, the psychology is revealed in the music, the subtext, everything that's important that a stage director really needs to know about. And there are those who do, and there are those who don't. And I mean, for example, when I was still just out of, in fact, I was still in high school when Cherot did The Ring in Bayreuth, and there was a huge scandal. But what I and what other musicians said was, because the scandal was all about this transplanting the ring to the 19th century and so on and so on. But in terms of what psychologically the characters were doing, it was so closely based on every bar of music. You know, it was simply great. And so that's really the criteria. And it's not the question, is it old-fashioned or is it modern, or what era is it set in? Although I don't see any particular reason for putting Così fan tutte, you know, in the shipyards of Shanghai or whatever it is. I mean, I don't really see what the advantage is, shall we say? Yeah. But if a stage director knows what they're doing and has an ear for the music and a feeling for it and a love for it in particular, this is my main things. If you don't really love the music, then leave it alone, right? But you were, I mean, the combination of the stage directors that you worked with, and then the triumvirate of conductors that you mentioned, I got
was
to
very
hear Claudio
lucky.
Abbado when I got to Vienna. I graduated in 1981, and I came to Vienna in 82. And that was, Mazel was still there for 2 years, and then there was a horrible scandal, and he left. And then Abbado came. And so I heard lots of Abbado at the opera. I went as often as I could, and I heard his Pelléas, which was stunning. He did repertoire. I mean, Pelléas hadn't been done in Vienna for at least 40 years. He did stuff that nobody in Vienna remembered ever hearing. He did Chovanshchina by Mussorgsky, and he did
That was fabulous.
which was also great,
Yeah.
And then of course he did all those Rossini. I mean, he did Viaggio a Reims and Turco in Italia and Italiana in Algeri, which were hair-raisingly. I mean, just the singers that were brought in, right? Because you need about 10 for
I can
singers.
tell you about the Viaggio because I worked on it.
Yeah.
The Viaggio a Reims was a reconstruction done by Maestro Alberto Zeddo, who was the wonderful Rossini specialist with whom I've spoken about with other guests, including Daniela Barcelona. We spoke about him a lot. And I knew him, and he had a circle of young people around him, and he would assign each one of us an opera to specialize in, and mine was Il Turco in Italia. But when they were doing this rediscovered work, which was Il Viaggio a Reims from, I believe, 1826, it was conducted by Abbado in Pesaro, in Rossini's birthplace, and Luca Ronconi conducted.
Mhm.
And it was basically an all-star cast,
Right.
down to the smallest roles. And the leading role was sung by Katia Ricciarelli as sort of she ran a spa in somewhere in Switzerland where people were waylaid en route to Reims for the coronation. And each got to do his or her aria as a character from a different country. There was a Polish countess, there was a British, there was her Sydney, and an Italian and French and so on. And it was like the European Union put on stage in 1826. And Ronconi did a brilliant job. Abbado was the guiding force for bringing this opera to light. And most of the cast transferred then to Vienna, except for Katia Ricciarelli. And she was replaced by Montserrat Caballé, of all people, who had a lot more of a sense of humor than
But that was fabulous.
I know. I love Ricciarelli, but you needed someone with a sense of humor. Ricciarelli sang beautifully.
Yeah, Caballé did it fantastic.
She was a little formal, and I guess she interpreted as being a Swiss, running her place, and she had to be serious about Swiss hotel keeping.
Solid Swiss.
But Caballé treated it. It was kind of like the Marx Brothers. And she was hysterically funny, and had the chance to be funny. And
she had what a triumph she had in Vienna. I remember.
Yeah.
Sensational.
And so that opera now has kind of entered the repertory. Yes. I also, among the great people I had the chance to work with, was Dario Fo, and I did Stravinsky with him in Milan, but he then was in touch with me when he went to Helsinki to direct Viaggio a Reims in Helsinki, because I had worked on the original.
Because you knew,
and he made it a different kind of very Dario Fo-esque production. It was still great. And it's an incredibly hard work to conduct and stage, but yes, Abbado did that among many things.
I mean, I remember that the opera goers in Vienna, whom I'm sure you also know, are very tradition oriented, and also even in terms of repertoire. So they don't immediately take to new things. So that was even more extraordinary, the sensational success that they had with that. But Abbado also was I mean, when you're the opera director, you are nominally the head of the Vienna Philharmonic, even though the Vienna Philharmonic doesn't have a chief conductor, but whoever's running the opera, more or less, if it's a conductor. So he did a lot of Vienna Philharmonic concerts with repertoire that one didn't associate with him as much, because he did a lot of Bruckner and he did a lot of all kinds of things. And the repertoire that he basically, the German and the Austro-German repertoire that he then kept on doing until the end and really focused more on. But back then in the 80s in Vienna, people and I do remember one very interesting moment, which was that he finally went ahead and did a traditional piece that everybody associated him with, Ballo. And
Un ballo in Maschera by Verdi.
With Ballo in Maschera by Giuseppe Verdi, with Pavarotti and Cappuccilli and who was it that got sick? The prince of the now my mind is drawing a blank. Very, very famous soprano. Oh, Margaret Price got sick, and a young singer from Graz jumped in, who had a sensational success. Gabriele Lechner, and it was truly delightful to see how Pavarotti kind of brought her along in the duet. It was fantastic, and it was musically great. Vocally, and she was also in very good voice. And and it was an immense triumph. And everybody at the time said, "Well, it's really too bad that Abbado is not doing the Verdi canon in Vienna." It was the only we would have all loved to have heard his Aida, his Don Carlo, his Falstaff, whatever, you know. But
well,
that was the
80s,
time.
Michael?
Sorry?
That was the 80s?
That was like 85 or so.
Yeah.
Or
I was at La Scala in the 70s when he was at La Scala, and he basically traversed the Verdi canon in the 70s with a lot of Strehler productions and Ronconi and
he had done them all, and he was great at them, but we didn't get to hear them.
No, I know, because he had been there, done that.
Yeah.
And not that we don't eternally love Verdi and go back to him. I certainly do. But I think that for Vienna, having at the most Italian of opera houses focused on Italian rep and tried to bring in the occasional Russian and French score and English score, in Vienna, he availed himself of doing German language operas. You know, with all due love and respect to James Levine, the best Wozzeck I ever heard was Claudio Abbado.
He did a very good Wozzeck, absolutely.
With Hildegard Behrens in Vienna, it was just
stunning.
Yeah.
Who was the baritone?
I don't even remember.
Behrens just knocked you out. So
I'll have to.
So it was just that this Ballo in Maschera was so delightful that people were kind of saying, at least one more of those, right? But as you said, he wasn't all that interested in that. He did it splendidly. And one very funny thing that he did was that he was conducting the New Year's concert that year. And one of the first pieces that he performed, which I don't think anybody else ever performed after that, you couldn't really repeat that, was Strauss' quadrille on themes from Ballo in Maschera, which was just hysterically funny.
I've never heard that.
With an endless accelerando at the end, faster even than even faster than the finale. Yeah. Anyway, but so there was also humor involved, and that was wonderful. But he did, as you say, he had traversed the Italian, and he was more interested in the German, and he did some very interesting things. And so, getting back to, we were talking about teaching briefly. We don't need to spend that much time on it, but I will say, going and seeing. And I mean, my great good fortune when I was studying in Vienna was that there were still a couple of people working at the Staatsoper that had known my father when he was a member of the ensemble in the 50s.
Tell us what your father did. I know, but please tell our listeners.
My father was a Helden baritone who specialized in Wagner, but also sang the heavy Italian, the Amonasro and Scarpia and that repertoire. And he was a member of the ensemble in Vienna from 55 to 60, and then in Munich. And so that's the music I grew up with. And so there were.
Although you are officially, you have an American passport, and you went to high school and university here in the States, but basically you've lived and worked in Europe almost your entire life.
Well, except of course that I was raised by two American-born parents who just happened to be opera singers and living in Europe at the time. That's why it happened. So there was plenty of Americana inflected into my upbringing. But yes, in terms of where I've lived, it's been mostly in Europe.
And I would guess your musical approach.
Very, very likely.
Yeah.
Yes. As we said, but again, so there were a couple of people still around so that I had access. In the first few years that I was in Vienna studying, I could basically go to the proscenium loge whenever I wanted. And within the first few weeks of being in Vienna, I heard Grubarova sing Lucia with a high E flat that started pianissimo and filled the house and just knocked us all off our seats. And I heard Christoph Perrick, as he's called in the English-speaking world, do a fabulous Parsifal. And I heard just any number of just extra. So I got to go to the opera.
No, we're not getting naughty here, but his name is spelled P-R-I-C-K. But when he came to conduct at the Met, he added the letter E between the P and the R and became Christoph Perrick.
And so on his recordings issued internationally, that is also sometimes the way the name is spelled. In any case, very, very, very good Wagner conductor. And so I got, as I said, so I got to sit in the proscenium loge from, for people who don't know, that's on the very side. You're actually sitting behind the last row of orchestra musicians down in the pit, except further up. And you can look down and see exactly what they're doing, and you can see exactly what the conductor is doing. And that I learned a great deal about, not just about conducting, but also about extraordinary traditions in the instrumental handling of things. For example, I'm trying to remember what passage it was. I think it was an Elisir performance, Elisir d'Amore, where there is an eighth note pizzicato in the basses and the double basses. And I looked down at the double basses, and there were quite a few of them for this composer. It wasn't 3 or 5, but there were like 6 or 7 of them playing very, very softly and beautifully. One desk was playing just the eighth notes on the strong beats. One desk was playing the eighth notes on the off beats, and the principal desk was playing them all. And the result was an incredibly sonorous pizzicato because they weren't stopping. I mean, I've never seen that written about anywhere. It was just something that they did. So,
and this was Christoph Perrick who was leading that?
The Elisir was one of the house conductors. I think it might have been Jüdische Code, a Czech conductor who that I remember was not the revelatory, but when I heard his Bluebeard's Castle, that was unbelievable. With and anyway,
one clarification I want for where you were seated: was it on the left side of the auditorium or the right side?
It was from the audience's perspective to the left, so behind the first violins, and
so you saw the conductor's left hand.
I saw the conductors. I saw both of them, but that was the one closest to me. Yes.
Okay. There are reasons. There are a few reasons I asked, but one is going back to our friend George Schulte. Of all the conductors I've ever seen, he had by far the most expressive left hand. Would you, as a conducting teacher, explain what the right hand does and the left hand does for a conductor?
Well, if you are right-handed, the right hand is the baton hand, and in the opera, what we are taught, what I was taught in Vienna, is that you essentially lead the orchestra with the baton, and the right hand is for the stage. The right hand is for cueing singers. The right hand is for, which is different than in Italy, right, where the suggeritore is leading the singers and the conductor is just doing it. But in the German-speaking part of Europe, the conductor is supposed to do everything. So you are in control. The right hand is for the stage, giving cues, not just giving cues, because the singers, of course, know when they're singing, although sometimes stage direction makes it difficult for them to hear what the orchestra is doing, but also in what way, and to breathe, and to give them the feeling that you are with them and supporting them, and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. So, and in symphonic conducting, of course, it's a little bit different because you're using both hands for the entire orchestra, but again, the baton hand is more for the tempo, and the left hand is more for articulation and emphasis.
And that, to me, was one of the things that I love with Schulte. I would buy tickets for Schulte performances that were different from other conductors because I wanted to be where I could see the left hand. And sometimes it meant being on the left side of the opera house or concert hall. But often I would get a box seat that had almost no view of the stage.
Right. So
that I could watch Schulte. If it's, let's say it was Tosca and I knew Tosca backwards and forwards, I didn't have to see the stabbing and the jump. I could watch George Schulte.
what Schulte was doing was much more dramatic in any case. Right?
True.
It was very, very dramatic. Some said histrionic, but always 120% in the music, and everything he did was in order to get the expression that he wanted.
Because people talk about Bernstein being overactive on the podium, but to me, it's not that Schulte was overactive, but there was so much going on, as you say, and I love to watch his eyes.
Yes, very alert and just with electricity.
Yeah.
But also, I would recommend to anyone who's interested in this to go to YouTube and find him rehearsing. Especially, there's a from the documentary on the making of the Götterdämmerung recording, for example, and you just see with how much energy he is leading every rehearsal and every take, and there's of course also that whole documentary made and Kulshaw wrote the book and so on and so on.
John Kulshaw wrote a book called Ring Resounding about the making of, it's a classic, about the making of what we call the Schulte ring.
Just one of the pioneering things that was done in the recording industry, but also just when you see Schulte in these brief excerpts, these films, his energy level is just astounding. And of course, that was when he was a much younger man, but he essentially maintained that energy level all the way
to the end, to the very end. Is that the documentary with the horse?
Yes. Yes, where they come in and Birgit Nilsson kind of looks over her shoulder.
She's about to say, there was a lot of tension in the rehearsals and, recording, yes. And it was high stakes. And Birgit Nilsson was Brunhilde and had to sing the immolation scene, Starkes Scheide, where she calls Grana her horse. And I think to relieve the tension, they arranged for actually a horse to be brought over from the riding stables at the Spanish riding school.
From the Spanish riding school, one of the Lipizzano's, yeah.
And they brought a horse in, and Nielsen and Schulte and everybody broke out laughing. And that was done, frankly, to reduce the tension.
And it is one of the most remarkable recordings of all time.
It is.
I'll add just one more horse thing, which is somebody who was there at the time told me that when Chiraut first staged Walküre, he wanted 8 horses at the beginning of Act 3, real horses. And unfortunately, the stage was quite strongly raked. I mean, it was quite an incline. And so horses got nervous and do what horses do. And there was this huge mass of solid and liquid kind of sliding down in the direction of the orchestra. So he had to change. He had to change that.
There is actually another related story told to me by the person who was involved in the story. Astrid Varnay was a magnificent Hungarian, Swedish, American dramatic soprano, and great. And I think had Birgit Nilsson not come along and sort of eclipse that, and right before that was Kirsten Flagstad, we'd remember Varnay. But I know many contemporary Wagner singers who looked at Varnay as the model more than Flagstad or Nilsson. And she was a wonderful person. And she would tell the story of singing in a production of Götterdämmerung at the end, calling for Grana the horse, and they had a real horse. And Varnay, in this very traditional production, was a Brunhilde that had sort of a long train of her dress.
Oh dear.
And so she was holding the horse and singing, and the horse was quivering, and the ears were going like that. And then the horse sort of was sent away, and Varnay, in a dramatic gesture in the moment, grabbed her train and said, okay, now we're going into the fire, and flung the train forward, not knowing that the horse had deposited a lot of material there, and went right into the orchestra pit.
Oh no.
On the conductor on the first row of people.
Oh my God. Well,
and she kept singing, but
of course. Well, since you bring up Astrid Varnay,
yeah,
I have to say, my father had the great good fortune to sing Wotan with her as well as with Nilsson. And he told me, this is what I remember him telling me the story. I was still very young. He said, of course, Nilsson's voice was unbelievable, but when you get to the final scene, when you get to the Wotan's Abschied, and there's the great embrace, right? There's that orchestral interlude where they embrace finally. And he said, and with Nielsen, I mean, you know, the embrace would take place, and you could, his words were, you could feel the icicles forming under her fingernails. And Varney was simply the warmest, most effusive, most emotionally engaged, and he loved singing with them. There's actually a recording of the two of them singing Valkyrie in Duisburg in the 60s that someone gave me when I was guest conducting there, a pirate recording of the whole piece, Varney and him. And so I grew up hearing lots about Varney and what a wonderful artist she was. And of course, I mean, there's that legendary when she jumped in to sing Sieglinde at the Met and basically started an international career kind of from one day to the next when she was in her early 20s or whatever it was. So I think that what also happened was that by the time she was in her late 40s, she'd been singing this repertoire for a quarter of a century. And that's about as long as you can sing these roles. So where other singers might not have started it till 10 or 15 years later. And so some of the singers who were not much older than she was, but Nielsen then kind of ruled the roost. But I'm a huge fan of Astrid Varney. And of course, I love her, you know, when she went on then to do Clytemnestra and Herodias and the various other character mezzo parts that she sang when she got older.
Well, I got to know her late in her career when I was a younger man at the Met. And we were doing Kurt Weill's Mahagoni, The Rise and Fall of the Sea of Mahagoni. And she played Frau Begbig.
Of course.
And she was pleased, let's say, with the fact that I knew who she was.
Okay.
And her career and had read up about her. I mean, I felt it was part of my job to know the people I'm dealing with. But I think she felt a little forgotten by the younger generation. And therefore, I come in and talk to her. And so she sat down, and she was not one of these artists who sort of unburdens the same stories repeatedly, but she actually listened and would answer questions. And I would talk about conductors and repertoire and productions. And she answered my questions. And, you know, would that we had a kind of device that we have now that I could have documented.
I'm sure there were many very, very wonderful things that she said. I had a friend when I was studying in Vienna who had the biggest vinyl collection I'd ever seen, and he was an opera person, so he just had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands, I don't know, a lot of live recordings. And one time he and I started talking about Varney, and he said, "Oh, let me show you something." And he had a special shelf where there were, you know, it was this many opera recordings, and it was all from 1 month in 1953 or something. And it was completely superhuman. I mean, it was 1 month. She had something like 20 performances that month. And it was...
Was this in Bayreuth, 1953?
They weren't all in Bayreuth because they weren't all Wagner. It was like this. 1 week it was, you know, Fidelio, Brünnhilde, Isolde, you know, I mean, it was 4 or 5 days a week for a whole month. And you can actually tell at the end of that month that she's starting to get, you know, Electra. I mean, just, so in terms of a singer who just pulled absolutely no punches, Nielsen was always very, very careful, you know, about how often she sang and where. And I kind of also have the feeling that she was so engaged, and she was a little bit reckless in terms of because no human voice really could and her voice did, you know, she did it for 20 years or longer. It's extraordinary, certainly the question of, because that's a question I'm sure that you have also spent a lot of time thinking about, you know, who sings which roles when in their career, and how old are they, and are they ready or aren't they, and who is their mentor, and who talks them into singing it when they're not ready yet, and so on. And this is
usually it's their manager who talks them into singing it when they're not ready to make a little money. Well, and I'm not belittling, because yes, we do this because we try to make a living, and singers have a lot of expenses in their lives, and we don't know how long the careers go, even if they're beautifully preserved voices. And so therefore I understand why they may take on something a bit sooner and in some cases do damage, and in other cases find that they had a capacity they didn't anticipate.
I would say that it seems to me that singers who are put into, let's say, overly dramatic parts, I don't just mean Wagner and Strauss, but also some Verdi parts or Puccini parts, not because a manager forced them to do it, but because a stage director thought that they looked right. And that older singers...
I agree, but also a conductor. Herbert von Karajan famously tried to put Morella Freni into heavy roles, and she did some of them, but she said no to Madame Butterfly. And they ultimately did it on film, but not.
I remember that film with Domingo, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think Karajan directed the film as well, yes. Practically.
Yes.
But
do you know the Karajan song by Georg Kreisler? It's a German, Georg Kreisler, one of the great Jewish cabaret entertainers and satirists, and always accompanied himself on the piano quite extraordinarily. And he did a thing called the Karajan Lied, which is essentially Largo al Factotum in German, and it's all about Karajan. One of the lines is
the aria from the Barber Seville that the barber sings about.
Yeah.
So it's here, down, up, everywhere.
So ich bin das musikalische Universal. Ich bin das musikalische Universalgenie. Und versetze die Kritik in Rage. Ich dirigiere und führe zugleich Regie und kassiere die doppelte Gage. I conduct and stage direct at the same time and get twice as much money. So Karajan did tend to stage direct a lot. Yes.
I think we should send that to my friend Thomas Hampson.
I'd be surprised if he didn't know it, but you ask him.
No, I will. But if Tom doesn't know it, Tom does the show here on Thursdays. I would love to hear Tom perform that. Because his German is flawless. He knew Karajan. I mean, it would be rather fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
And he sang the barber. That's the other thing.
Yes,
he
of course.
Wonderful barber, Figaro.
So the other thing, as long as we're talking about baritones, did you ever see or see even on film the Ritorno d'Ulisse that Jeffrey Tate conducted in Salzburg? This was in 1984, 83, 84. Mm-hmm. Jeffrey Tate.
Who I knew, Monteverdi.
And what they did was, it was Monteverdi, but it was Monteverdi orchestrated by Henze. So there was a symphony orchestra, sized orchestra, and Thomas Allen was Ulisse. And it was just breathtaking.
I can imagine.
And James King was brought out to sing Giove. And he sang those coloraturas pretty well, I have to say. Everybody was quite stunned. But anyway, Thomas Allen was what I was thinking of. Just another great.
One of my very favorite artists. Would you talk about Jeffrey Tate? Because he's a name that doesn't come off very often. I knew Jeffrey quite well. And people who didn't know him and about him, would you talk about him?
Well, he was, Scholti talks about him in his autobiography, because Jeffrey Tate was once one of his assistants, and he found that he was a very talented young musician who, of course, whose life was made very difficult for him by spinal curvature. And so the challenges to making a music career and a conducting career were immense. But he was a very fine conductor, and I just want people to understand he was quite curved over. He used one cane and then two canes, and he walked with great difficulty, and the feet were imbalanced. He had a very large, handsome head. Yes.
And he had very long arms.
Yes.
Relative to the rest of his body.
Very expressive hands. And
And what I mean is that because the rest of the body was so compromised physically, that he used his face a lot more and his hands a lot more than do many conductors. And the effects he got, I worked with him on Mozart mostly, were quite something.
Yes.
And again, as a conductor and a teacher of conducting, would you talk about how Jeffrey could accomplish that?
Well, I think that he already belonged to a generation where it was not just automatically assumed that conductors would sit in a room with singers and work with them. And he was trained by Scholti and others to do that. So he had a very good rapport with the soloists. And it's always important to know the gestures that you use when you conduct, or let's say the gestures that you use by the time you get to the performance, are not as important as some people might think, because you have been rehearsing and you've been explaining or using whatever methods you can to impart what you want musically to singers and to the orchestra. And when you get to the performance, the question is, how emotional do you dare be? Because less so than singers, but the principle is still the same. If you get too emotional about the music that you're making, you may lose control. For a singer, of course, it's much, much worse, because the emotions immediately affect what happens to the vocal cords. And so they always have to have a certain amount of control while producing the effect of intense emotional engagement. But for a conductor, it's similar. You have to try and get the message across in the rehearsal. Now, of course, there's a tension and something going on in a performance that you can't ever have in a rehearsal. There's an audience, and there are all kinds of other factors. But I think that Tate was, he rehearsed excellently, and by the time they got to the performance, his expressive hands and his expressive face were there to reinforce what they already knew that he wanted, and just to see to it, which is our main function, of course, that everything stays on the tracks. And what actually is more difficult and especially important in opera conducting, that one develops an instinct for when things might go off and prevent it from starting to happen before it happens. And that can be a color in the voice of a singer, or a breathing problem, or something that happens in an orchestral section, and so on. So that's the thing about opera conducting, and which is why some conductors prefer not to do opera conducting. It's there's so many vectors, so much can go wrong, not just musically, but scenically, physically. Things happen, accidents happen on stage. I remember the horror stories I read about the new Ring in New York, and that,
yes,
with its moving parts that a couple of times got very close to really hurting somebody.
Well, actually, Deborah Voigt, I went to the premiere when she arrived singing Hayataho as Brunhilde, was smacked in the back by one of these boards, pieces of scenery, at her first entrance. Oh, Hayataho, I'm not a singer, Hayataho, wham.
Oh my God.
And she fell down, and she picked herself up. She's very game and ready to get back into it. And
well, I mean, she could have been seriously hurt. I mean,
well, other people, have had injuries, but it's just that, I'm not here to criticize that particular production, but there are productions all around the world I've seen that present dangers and accidents to the performers who are in them.
And it's hard enough as it is. That's what stage directors sometimes don't, or set designers. I have to say that, when I worked in theater in Germany, there was a thing that was done there, and unfortunately, I don't think it happens at a lot of the big opera houses, but the idea was you had a new production coming out, and before the first blocking rehearsal, there was a meeting of stage director and set designer and conductor with a model, and you would discuss things.
Model of the set.
A model of the set.
Yeah, not a good looking one.
I mean, and it was called Bühnenbildabnahme, the sort of acceptance of the set by everyone involved. And so, and of course, in today's kind of star system, Gergiev will come in 2 days before the premiere or 1 day before the premiere. So he hasn't seen the set and he has no idea. And of course, it's way too late to change anything by then. So I think that sometimes things will happen. Situations on stage will arise, which wouldn't have been necessary if it had been done kind of in this traditional, but that requires people to be there earlier, and people are jetting around and so on. And opera is a serious business. It needs a lot of preparation, and especially today where there's so many things happening on stage more than there used to be, because people are expecting visual spectacle and so on, moving parts. It's a big challenge, and there are singers who are able to cope with that, and then there are those who find it very, very difficult.
And I sympathize with them a lot.
Of course.
I do. I mean, I love good stage action as much as anyone else, and anyone who's ever worked on production and stage direction has in his or her head 2 or 3 ideal productions that they would stage if given the budget, the opportunity, and the technology. And one of mine involves what we call a coup de théâtre at the end of this production. I'm not going to tell in case I forget to do it, but it would take a lot of rehearsing just of that coup de théâtre to make it happen at the right moment. Sure. While a solo soprano is singing up a storm. And she cannot worry about what's going to happen behind her, but I have to make sure that it happens in the moments of the music that this composer did, this composer who worked a lot at Dresden. And because otherwise, if it doesn't work, then it just looks like we're sloppy and something broke.
Timing is split-second timing is essential. Yeah. If you're going to do that kind of thing. I mean, but you also know from your own experience, I mean, there are challenges that arise from set decoration, costumes, and then there are things that happen because a stage director made a particular decision. I remember how shocked I was because I went to conduct Ariadne of Naxos in Düsseldorf, and it was just repertoire that was about it. So there were no, you know, just you met the singers in a room and did a little ensemble on the piano, and then you did the performance. So I suddenly realized that the Zabinetta, there was an apron that had been made on the edge of the orchestra pits, which was also played upon by the soloists. And Zabinetta was kind of whirling around back there while she was doing her big aria. And just before she got to the absolute acuto, she had to lie flat down on her back and sing that whole passage like that. And I was kind of, you know, she did it, you know, she was able to do it. But I thought to myself, really, somebody would have needed to explain to whoever that stage director was, that sort of thing is not really helpful.
No.
Nor did I see any particular point to it, except that it was
I assume you mean Großmächtige Prinzessin, the aria, which is about 14 minutes long. It's one of the hardest arias.
One of the very hardest numbers in the whole literature, of course.
Yeah.
Anyway,
let her move as she feels she needs to move. Do not.
Well, I mean, it's just like I mean, there's back in earlier days, a singer simply, you know, she might have rehearsed it that way, but when the performance came, she just wouldn't do it. But today, the singers have been trained. Saying, no, if you don't do exactly what's asked of you, you won't be hired again, and so on. So this is an ongoing challenge.
Yeah.
But naturally, I always have a sympathy for the singers, because having parents as singers and having grown up with hearing from the time I could understand language, all about questions of, you know, breath, support, eye contact with the conductor, and other things. Those are just things that are necessary to keep the machine going, and it could come to a rather unpleasant stop if one disregards those things.
So talk about eye contact, and I mean in opera now, not in symphonic. A few years ago, I had as my guest in a thing I did in New York Live, the wonderful singer from Latvia, Violeta Urmana. Mm-hmm. And I say singer because she sung both mezzo and soprano repertory. Mm-hmm. And she was in New York doing Oda Bella in the Met premiere of Attila, conducted by Riccardo Muti, who is no shrinking violet, and nor is Violeta Urmana, despite her name. And I said to her in front of an audience, I said, so when you're singing this, you look at Maestro Muti. She said, I don't look at Maestro Muti. Maestro Muti looks at me.
Well, this is the classic. I was told a story by a friend of my parents who was a stage actor of Irish stock and had a lot of funny stories, but had been just in love with opera all his life, and married a Swedish mezzo-soprano eventually. And he told me about when he was very young, that he was there singing in the chorus in Chicago when Callas came. And I think he was talking about Aida, but I'm not sure. Anyway, this is a very long time ago. And she came in with this huge pair of glasses on and went to the apron and said to whoever the conductor was, who's now I've forgotten, she took his glasses off and said, I can't see you, so you're just going to have to follow me. That was the beginning of the rehearsal. So yeah.
Let's see, I would guess would be the year 2000. I would have to look it up. was hired by the Lyric Opera of Chicago, which is the first company I ever worked at,
Okay.
to write a company history because they were turning 50. And the company, they give their birth date as November 1st, 1950, with Callas.
Right.
And she did Tosca there, Norma there, and Madama Butterfly, famously, where some journalist asked her a question and she absolutely blew up in the wings in her butterfly costume. And this picture can easily be found. You just Google Callas Madame Butterfly Chicago, right, and you see her absolute rage. And you just wish that she was wearing Tosca or a different costume. But yeah, she was very nearsighted.
Yes.
Michael, I don't know if I ever told you, but my main teacher of direction before I got to those famous directors was actually Tito Govi, the baritone. And he worked with her constantly and knew all about her. And he was a brilliant first teacher for me.
One of the great baritones.
Clicked, and he was a great artist, but also understood the theater and did his own makeup and drew drawings of gestures to understand whether it's Falstaff or Scarpa or whatever. Mm-hmm. And he explained to me why Callas did a lot of her second act gestures as she did in Tosca, because she was very nearsighted. And when it looked like she was sort of feeling around and there was fear and anticipation,
she just wanted to see where she was.
She didn't see. And so he understood that about her and went with that.
Yes.
And allowed her to do that. And then he would suddenly arrive and puff out his chest and jut out the jaw, and her hand would go on his chest. And that was enough sexual tension and dramatic tension. He didn't have to do big gestures because she couldn't see them anyway.
Right.
So that was in part his genius, but also she was a genius, her natural connection to these characters through her own musicality, but physicality.
Well, I mean, she was the most musical singer of all time, and every phrase, any conductor, anybody who ever had the fortune to accompany her would just notice that it was all so incredibly musical that the music it was so natural and expressive. I certainly heard a lot of stories about all sorts of different soloists that my parents met. My father sang his first Scarpia in Vienna opposite Lyuba Velic.
Oh my goodness. Was a famous Salome.
She was a famous Salome, but she was also famous for something else, long past now, and so is my father. So Lyuba Velic was famous in Vienna, and these stories were even told by people my age who were studying there, whose parents were in the opera. Lyuba Velic had a special way of preparing for performance. She had to have 2 stagehands before the show.
Not their hands.
To have them, 2 of them. Anyway, this, of course, was back in 1955 when everything was still sung in German.
Now, I'm about to ask a question. I'm speaking to you from a practical man of the theater point of view. Sometimes I was in the managerial positions in the Met and other theaters where I had to arrange for the things that the artist needed before the performance, or required or requested or whatever. And it might be as simple as Vladimir Horowitz wanting his lounge made in a certain way with a pillow that had 70% goose feathers, 30% duck, or whatever. He had his list, and that was fine.
Sure.
But yes, there were other artists, and not just at the Met, who had requirements of the type that you describe. And I would not go around procuring stagehands or anyone else for this work. There were volunteers.
Depending on who the artist was and what they were like, yeah.
And I had to sort of discreetly sort that out because, frankly, I also had to check with the artist in question whether she or he would be pleased to have that particular person come visit. And, I felt like I was procuring, in addition to all the other things I had to worry about.
You were suddenly in a role that you had not anticipated.
And in all my studies, no one ever told me that I was going to have to do that.
Right. There was not a special lecture on that.
No.
Well, I mean, that's the theater. And again, I mean, whatever worked for the artist, and whatever helped them. Sometimes it's quite surprising to find out what it was that people needed. I mean, it was usually more psychological than physical, but
yeah,
in any case, all those stories that we heard about, Corelli locking himself into his dressing room because in the duet, Nielsen had held the note longer than him, and he wouldn't come out for the rest of the show and all that. So, those are.
But I mean, as you well know, I don't name names in public on things because I'm not a gossip. But there was one very famous artist who is a wonderful artist, one of my favorites, who he's a man. When he was at the Met in the early 80s, when I was there, I knew him from the 70s from La Scala, and we formed a friendship there, and he trusted me then. So when I was at the Met in the 80s and this man came to perform at the Met, we had almost a whole ritual of my coming to his dressing room to not literally, but metaphorically talk him down from the ceiling and get him calm enough that I could get him to the stage. And the woman who was my assistant knew that on the nights when this artist was present in the theater, she would have to do more of the show because I had to keep.
You had to take time for the soloist, yeah.
And he is a major artist. And if that's what was needed to get him to feel comfortable singing in front of the Met audience, the audience didn't know, because by the time he got to the stage, I had calmed him down.
They weren't meant to know, of course.
Yeah. And I would imagine that in other theaters, he had a similar person do the same routine with him to get him to the stage. And, I say this for our listeners because they need to understand that singers and musicians and actors are not machines.
No.
And that what they do is something that's very, on a high tightrope, walking without a net below. And sometimes you have horses and goats and sheep and everything. Zeffirelli, we had a lot of sheep. But all of these things going on, it's scary. It's thrilling, but it's scary.
It's a very stressful profession. Yeah. For everybody involved. I have to tell one famous story. I was just thinking, I was saying they were doing Tosca in German, and then Karajan came in 1956, and they started doing everything, or 57, in the original language, especially because he was bringing up all the soloists from La Scala that he was running at the same time. And so there was a tenor, very beloved, famous tenor, in Vienna, Karl Terkal was his name, who in the German-speaking era sang everything from Rodolfo down, and who suddenly was not able to sing because he didn't know Italian. And Karajan loved his voice and offered him to pay for him to go to Milano for a year and learn the parts, on salary, and, to take a year off essentially on salary in order to learn his parts and then come back to Vienna and sing them. And Karl Terkal, who was a very, very devoted family man, very sort of domestically oriented, begged him not to send him away from his family. And so Karajan said, well, I'm sorry, but then, so it turned out then that what were they going to do? They didn't want to fire him. So it turned out that he actually was a trained carpenter. So they put him into the workshops, building the sets, and he was able to stay on until his retirement. He had, however, learned one thing in Italian, Di Rigori from Rosenkavalier, the tenor aria in Act 1, considered one of the most difficult numbers in the world for any tenor to sing. So he could sing that. He wasn't allowed to go on and sing, but he had it in his repertoire. And whenever he heard that a famous Italian guest tenor was coming to do a Rosenkavalier, he would find out where their dressing room was, and then he would walk up and down the hall, giving out with Di Rigori, and whoever the poor guest was, and we're talking about nerves, and people, whoever have sang in Di Rigori was always nervous,
Sure.
would stick their head out of the door and look at this guy wandering off singing Di Rigori, and when asked who that was, would be told, "Das ist unser Tischler," that's our carpenter. So, yeah, playing on the nerves of the, yeah. I don't know how much time we have left.
Well, I have about a half hour. I wanted now to go straight to Dresden, actually. And it's a remarkable city. I've seen you there. I've been there otherwise. I just made a few notes. It's 540,000 people. It was the capital of Saxony when Saxony was an independent state. It was unfortunately severely strafed and bombed in World War II. People who read Kurt Vonnegut's book, Slaughterhouse-Five, depicts his time in Dresden. I actually visited that place where he was hiding during the bombing, which is on the edge of town near a convention center. The city center has the Elbe River, which is a very beautiful river, and it sort of forms vistas, and there are hills on one side, and a lot of wine grapes are grown there, and there's a wonderful dairy that I remember on the other side of the river, and beautiful museums, some of the greatest museums anywhere. It's known as the Florence on the Elbe River, because people would go there, even if they were not musical, just for the remarkable art collections that are in several museums, not just one museum, but several. Caspar David Friedrich, there's a whole collection. It's in the Albertinium, I think it's called. In
the Albertinum. There's also Caravaggio, and there's all kinds of things, yeah. And
there's the famous Raphael angels that everybody copies, and the Green Vault, which has all kinds of treasures. And so people can go there as an art town, but I love doing that. But when I think just simply of the fact that 9 of Richard Strauss's 15 operas were premiered in Dresden between 1901 and 1938, including Salome, Rosenkavalier, Elektra, Arabella, Schweigsame Frau, Daphne, these wonderful works. Yes, even though he never lived in Dresden.
Right.
Do you know why his operas were always, not always, but often had their premieres in Dresden?
The Dresden Orchestra was, of course, once the orchestra of Karl Maria von Weber, and after that, of course, Wagner's orchestra, who famously referred to it as meine sächsische Wunderharfe, my Saxon magic harp. So this orchestra had a tremendous...
It's always about him.
Well, this is another subject.
We're going to get to Wagner
we're going to get to Wagner, but the orchestra and Richard Strauss. I mean, so Richard Strauss sort of inherited this opera orchestra, as you say, not as an employee of the opera house, but as a regular guest conductor. People don't realize, unless they've sort of looked into this, what a famous and revered conductor Richard Strauss was. Not just of his own works, but he was a very revered Mozart conductor. He was just an all-around musician. And of course, his conducting style, very famously, which is completely contradictory to everything we have today, when conducting has become almost like ballet. It's choreographed and very flamboyant. Richard Strauss conducted with, one hand in his watch pocket here, and everything from the wrist, and then he would occasionally look down, and if now that's kind of what they would tell about his conducting. George Zell used to tell those stories, but he had complete control of the orchestra, and kind of all just in this little, and the tip of the baton would make things, but the hand would make almost no. And he had I mean, there are very, very many famous things he wrote down, and everybody reads them, the 10 golden rules for the Kapellmeister, which include things like, a conductor should never sweat, the audience should feel hot under the collar, but, and other remarks such as, don't distract the musicians, they have important work to do. Everything that calls for, everything sort of scaled down and just the essentials, which of course you can do if you're working with one of the great orchestras of the world, right? Not if you're working with an orchestra, you have to give them every little. Mm-hmm. But he loved the Dresden Orchestra. There was a great tradition there. Karl Schuricht, who was one of the famous conductors before World War I, famously, Richard Strauss wrote to him that not until he had heard Salome conducted by Schuricht did he really hear it the way he wanted it to sound. So he also had a great rapport with and respect for some of the other conductors. Mm-hmm. And he loved going there, and he loved premiering his works there. And of course, there were other great conductors that kind of immediately followed Schuricht, including one when we get around to talking about last Sunday. One of the things I told the Semperoper general manager was, when are you going to put up a bust of Fritz Reiner, who was the chief conductor here and conducted 900 performances and was one of the greatest conductors of the century, because he's missing. And only Sinopoli, God rest his soul, managed before he died to have Fritz Busch put back in the gallery in Dresden, who had also been, famously kicked out, even though he was not a Jewish conductor, but he was refusing to work with the Nazis. So there's an incredible legacy of conductors in Dresden. And Richard Strauss also, there was an excellent ensemble there. And of course, Strauss operas, the older he got, the more ensemble the operas become, and had a great, I think, regard for many of those soloists, male and female. So today, the orchestra, of course, is a little bit more international than it was, but it still does retain a lot of musicians from the area who were trained in that particular way and who've tried to maintain their sound, which Thielemann has been very good about preserving. And his performances, when on those rare occasions when he does conduct in Dresden at the Opera House, have been quite magnificent. So
let's talk about the Opera House, and then I know that you appeared there very recently. It's called the Semperoper, named for the architect. Now, I know of other opera houses, including La Scala, where they talk about it. They call it Il Teatro di Pier Marini. Pier Marini was the architect, but everyone knows La Scala. But this theater is actually named for the architect. It was built in the late 1830s, early 1840s. It's gorgeous. It was largely, unfortunately, destroyed in the Second World War and lovingly rebuilt. And it's a rather remarkable building. And so, because you've conducted there, how are the acoustics?
They're fabulous. The Opera House, this rebuilt version of the Opera House is not the theater from the 1830s, which is where Wagner conducted, because that burned down in the 1860s, I think it was. So Semper, who had already designed another one, which is the one that we have now, which is stylistically similar, but not quite the same. But Semper, of course, the idea that it was named after the architect is a modern invention. It certainly wasn't called that. Back in the old days, it was the Royal Opera House, the Königliche Hoftheater, the Royal Court Opera, just the way the Vienna State Opera was called. But Semper was such a legendary architect that sometime in modern times, they decided to call the opera. And he's also the architect of what is regarded locally there as the most important German theater for the spoken word, which is the Burgtheater in Vienna.
In Vienna, yeah.
Exactly the same style as the Semperoper, but of course not quite as big. And famously, he also built his only synagogue here in Dresden, which was the old synagogue, which was destroyed in 1938. But just a highly revered personality who also, along with Wagner, took part in the revolution in 1849 and had some difficulties. And the acoustics there are just simply unbelievable. and the opera house there. I mean, there are many things about it. There's this incredible orchestra there, also one of the very finest opera choruses in the business. I was absolutely stunned when Alan Gilbert came to Dresden,
Yep.
not that many years ago, to do the first premiere of the new general manager, who picked of all pieces Moses und Aaron for his first premiere.
Mm-hmm.
And the chorus parts in that are
Schoenberg, yeah.
hair-raisingly, because it's 12-tone music, hair-raisingly difficult. And not only did they sing them brilliantly, but the stage direction had them all moving around. There were no chorus sections together. They were all running and walking and doing stuff. Anyway, incredible chorus there. And the House Acoustics, I mean, the concert that we did there last Sunday with...
Yeah, I want to hear about what you conducted there last Sunday.
Well, as we referred to briefly before, for 14 years, we've been reviving works by persecuted Jewish composers persecuted because of their Jewish descent. Even though most of them were very assimilated or didn't even think of themselves as Jewish, they all thought of themselves as German or Austrian or Central European. But so their works have been completely neglected and forgotten. And we've now had 3 generations of music teaching without them being named. So it's not even ill will anymore. It's just a complete lack of knowledge. It's just a sort of big white spot on the map. So we started performing this music, some of it by names famous from Hollywood, like Korngold and Waxman, who was from Dresden, a Dresdener. Another person whose name I'd like to see on a piazza or on a bus somewhere before I die. There's no public recognition of him. And so this year in Germany is a very special year because the year has been proclaimed by the German government. We are celebrating 1,700 years of Jewish life in Germany because of a document that exists from Emperor Constantine that mentions the Jewish community in 321. So 1,700 years, and about 800 or 900 of those years, there's also a history of Jewish community in Saxony. And so the Opera House came to me last year and said, let's do a series of events celebrating 1,700 years, and invited the chamber orchestra to play the opening concert of this series. So that was last Sunday, and we performed music by Mark Lavry, who was a composer from Riga, who studied in Leipzig, and then later went to Tel Aviv. We performed Roja. For those who don't know who Roja is, right? The composer of Ben-Hur and the composer of Ivanhoe and many other great movies from the 50s and 60s.
Miklos is his first name, right?
Miklos, yes.
Yeah.
His first big international success was The Thief of Baghdad, which was partially produced in London, and then they moved during the war to Hollywood. The Jungle Book, and then one of my favorite scores of his, Double Indemnity, with Frederick Moran, Barbara Stanwyck, and Edward G. Roberts. Yep. Anyway, a wonderful composer, and of course, famously with Raymond Land, The Lost Weekend. And so, anyhow, so he wrote this fabulous string quartet, and then when he was a very old man, he reorchestrated it for string orchestra. So we played a piece by him. Then I did what Mahler used to do, which is I took a chamber music piece by Korngold, the Sextet Opus 10, and arranged it for our chamber orchestra. And we performed 2 movements from that. Then we did an aria. And this was theater business at its most tantalizing. This is a composer I'd never heard of, Richard Fuchs, who was actually a music lover and very talented musician all his life, but who trained and very successfully worked as an architect in the Weimar period and had commissioned a lot of nice buildings and villas, and it's also been built a synagogue somewhere and so on. And who then couldn't be an architect anymore when the Nazis came in. And so he took up music again and started writing. And one of the first pieces he wrote was an aria called Hymnus an Gott, a hymn to God, for string orchestra, organ, and tenor, except that the music that the family in New Zealand, where he wound up, sent me, the piano score, was actually a baritone version, a fourth lower in E major. And so the opera said, oh, we'll have one of our soloists sing that. And so they got a baritone to study this score. And then the orchestra parts arrived. and it was the tenor version. And this was like 5 days ahead of the first rehearsal. So I called up the operator and said, there's been a slight mishap. We can't use the baritone, I'm afraid. Please find us a tenor quickly. So they did. And on the Friday evening before the performance, I got a phone call from the opera office informing me that this tenor had gotten sick. And so on the next day, which we had the dress rehearsal the day before the performance, because it was a matinee concert, we couldn't have the dress that day. So we had the dress the day before. So on that dress rehearsal, a tenor was provided to me from the opera, a fine tenor, John Dennis, who is one of their regular taminos, you know. So that was quite a luxury. So he came in, he learned it, you know, from one day to the next. So that was the next piece on the program. That was lovely. It was very nice to have something sung.
If you were in Vienna, you could have had a carpenter do it.
There you go. Absolutely. And then for the final piece of the program was the Sinfonietta by Waxman, which he wrote on commission for a concert in Switzerland and composed on the boat. And the parts were finished about the day before the first rehearsal. Anyway, all very dramatic. So this music was performed. Most of the people there, like at our concerts, had never heard it before. There was a lovely speech by the Minister of Culture, and there was a lovely speech by the general manager, and we had a reception afterwards. And I am hopeful that after 14 years of getting funding sort of from every 6 months to 6 months and grant applications after grant applications, that this will maybe help us get the culture minister activated so that we could get a little bit of a more of an ongoing funding. And that would be very important for us. But regardless of what happens, being on that stage with my ensemble was certainly a very, very exciting moment for me.
Congratulations. So we've been tiptoeing around this big figure named Richard Wagner, who was actually born in Leipzig, but in 1813, May 22nd, 1813. But this was a time of wars all over Europe, including a huge one, battle near Leipzig, the War of Nations, and Wagner's father was killed in that war when Wagner was an infant. And his mother went to Dresden and ultimately married someone else. And Wagner grew up in Dresden. And yes?
It's the story. I'm surprised there haven't been more movies made, because you couldn't write this, you couldn't make up this stuff. When Wagner was about 3 weeks old, his mother, maybe he was 6 weeks old. Anyway, he was a babe in arms. The mother, now widowed, or not quite yet widowed, because I think actually his father, he got sick then. He wasn't killed on the battlefield. He got like typhoid or something. Anyway, she took the baby and crossed where the front lines had just been like a week before and went to Bohemia, to Teplitz, in order to meet this actor that the family knew, Richard Geier. And so historians have often conjectured whether the reason she actually went and took the baby with her alone and undertook this perilous journey was because maybe Richard Geier was actually the father and not her husband. So that has never been completely resolved. It's not really all that important who it was, although lately historians tend that Geier wasn't the father. But the important thing about it was that Wagner grew up with this father complex, that he didn't know who his father was, and he was always unsure, and that all his tenors either lose or never meet their fathers. Siegmund loses his father. Siegfried wonders what his father looked like. Tristan has never seen his father. Parsifal has never seen his father. He was obsessed.
And Michael, it's interesting, and we won't go down this tangent now, but we can another time. With Verdi, it was the missing mothers.
Yes.
That's something we can explore one day.
Those are two very important subjects. But with Wagner, the added little thing that comes into it is that also Wagner suspected, horror of horrors, that possibly Geier was a Jew, and he was in fact born in Leipzig in what is regarded as the Jewish quarter, and his appearance conformed to the anti-Semitic stereotype: small, big head, big forehead, et cetera, et cetera. And so Wagner's later vitriolic anti-Semitism, which we all wish he hadn't expressed with his pen so much in his pamphlet and so on, also had some psychological fears attached to it. but at the same time made more complicated by the fact that whatever Gaia was, Wagner loved him dearly and bore his name until he was 13, actually. And he was the man who brought theater into the family and music and the arts. So Wagner's ambivalence on this whole subject becomes a very important subject when he's looking at his life, which is very, very complicated.
And just parenthetically, I recently had Elaine Thornton, who's a biographer of Meyerbeer, and her book just came out, so people can go to Adagio and look up Fred Plotkin, Elaine Thornton, and we discussed Wagner, obviously, because of Meyerbeer. But Wagner's presence is very notable in Dresden because he did a lot of he had his early successes there, including Rienzi, which I think, is Rienzi an underrated opera? I think so.
Well, from the conductor's viewpoint, the brilliant overture, which we'll hear played all over the world to the delight of the audiences, is one thing. And then come 5 hours, if it's not heavily cut, of music that is partially very hard to sing. And there have been all kinds of experiments made. In Munich, one time, they brought out a version in which Rienzi was actually a baritone, and strange things happening to it. You need a very particular kind of tenor. René Collo was a good Rienzi, you know. That's the kind of voice that you need. And the quality of the writing is not. There are passages in it that are not up to what we expect of Wagner. But he was very young when he composed it. He was inexperienced. It wasn't his first opera. It was his third opera. But after Die Feen and Das Liebesverbot. But Die Feen, which is quite prophetic and has a lot of sort of things about it that point forward, is more forward-looking. And Rienzi is really more like a Meyerbeer opera. It's more like a grand opéra, but unfortunately without the French style. You know, the libretto is not very good. And it has lots of long choruses, not all of which are kind of up to snuff. So my opinion is, if you could do a version of it in which you cut it down to maybe 3.5 hours, that would be long enough, and you would be.
And it would just be Rien.
It would be more. It would certainly be performed more often, but it's still hard to cast. But the thing about Meyerbeer that I always repeat to when I'm doing now and then at the museum, I still lead some groups to the museum. Meyerbeer got Wagner his Dresden job, and Wagner was so ungrateful later on. But when you read Wagner's letters from that period, the early correspondence with Meyerbeer, the way he addresses him in his letters is almost embarrassingly sycophantic, you know, and, you know, great beloved honored master, you know, 3 exclamation points and so on. Because Wagner knew he never would have gotten Rienzi performed without Meyerbeer's recommendation.
Yep.
And Meyerbeer, you know, you have to give Meyerbeer credit for recognizing the talent of this composer who hadn't been played anywhere. He showed him his Rienzi score in Paris, where Wagner, you know, was starving because he couldn't get any work except for doing, you know, trumpet arrangements of Favorita and things like that. So he got him that job. He wrote a letter to the intendant of Dresden, and Wagner was brought in, and Rienzi was a triumph. The greatest success Wagner ever had as a living composer. The audiences kept going back night after night. And then, and this is what I consider to be one of the great things about Wagner, with all his personality problems, he could have stayed in Dresden. He could have gone on writing works like Rienzi, and it would have been a smash. And he could have just done that. And many other composers who have had that kind of a success with their first opera have kind of done that. Wagner realized that this was not what he was musically interested in. And then he wrote his next 2 operas, which were so totally different, The Flying Dutchman and Tannhäuser, and they completely flopped. I mean, they were disasters. Nobody wanted to hear them. Nobody wanted to play them. The singers, including his niece, Johanna, who was quite a prima donna in Dresden, and who he wanted her to sing Senta, but she refused because she said, the costumes are so ugly, you know, I'd much rather sing, you know, Donizetti and, you know, have a gorgeous, anyway. So the fact that Flying Dutchman and Tannhäuser are played by every opera house in the world And Lohengrin wasn't even performed because he was then in the revolution and they canceled the premiere and so on and so on. But he kept on stylistically develop himself in the face of incredible adversity. And then, of course, he composed 2/3 of the Ring for the drawer, and because if Ludwig hadn't come along, it never would have been produced at all. So you've got to admire the fact that he, completely on his own and without knowing where and when things would be played, was inventing a new style for the stage and for the voice, which ultimately, of course, triumphed across the globe.
I'm just going to fill in a couple of dates. Rienzi premiered October 20th, 1842, in the, your German is 1,000 times better than mine, Königliches Hoftheater. And very soon thereafter, on January 2nd, 1843, so just a couple of months, The Flying Dutchman, and then Tannhäuser, October 19th, 1845, in what is now known as the Dresden version. People can look up the Paris version, the Dresden version. In my book, Opera 101, I have a chapter on Tannhäuser in those two versions. So, but the original was in Dresden. Wagner, that was the 1840s, was highly political. He, strangely, his politics at that time is stuff I might have embraced, not what he later became, but he was involved in an insurrection in May of 1849 and was arrested and jailed. It was in the market plots, the market square. And he had been writing Lohengrin, but he basically beat it out of town and out of Saxony and went ultimately to Switzerland to not get arrested. And Lohengrin, which he had written, and you'll talk about Lohengrin in a moment, he had written in Dresden and nearby. He never saw it produced in Germany for many, many years. It was Franz Liszt, who later became his father-in-law, who had it produced in Weimar in 1850. Would you talk about Lohengrin, Wagner, Dresden, Pirna, because it's a special story that you have a very notable hand in? That's why I want you to talk about it.
Well, let me go back for a moment to after Rienzi and the immense success of Rienzi, he was then made a permanent conductor. He got an appointment as a Royal Kapellmeister, which was a post for life with a generous salary and a generous pension. And so again, even disregarding what I said about musically, how his composition developed, he had a sure income for the first time in his life. And his political interest, it's a little bit difficult to understand because it's my considered opinion. It wasn't so much that he was that politically interested. It's that he had been trying to, after he was appointed as the Royal Conductor, to institute reforms in the court opera and orchestra. They're all very sensible things that have now all been done, like pensions for the musicians and so on. But at the time, he unfortunately did not go through channels. He wrote directly to the king because he wasn't getting what he wanted from the direction. So when the revolution hit France, and when in 1848 the revolution started sort of spreading out, I think that his perception was, this would be a good way to get my reforms done. We'll overthrow the powers that be and kind of start from scratch, and then I can do what I really want to do. I think that played a stronger part in his revolutionary zeal. But once he became involved, he not only took part in the revolution, he became one of its leaders. And when the insurrection had been beaten down with the Prussian troops, and Dresden and Berlin still have friction today because of what happened then, the Prussian troops being brought in by the Saxon government, there were three leaders of the revolution, Röckel and Bakunin, the Russian anarchist later, and Wagner. And Bakunin and Röckel were arrested and jailed. Röckel spent 12 years in prison. And the other reason Wagner wasn't jailed was because he got out, he happenstantially got out, and managed, he went to Weimar to where he gave Liszt the Lohengrin score. Liszt was a great admirer of Rienzi and was already making piano arrangements of numbers from Dutchman and Tannhäuser even back then, and trying to popularize Wagner's music. So before the revolution, this period that we're not going to talk about, he had finished Tannhäuser, And by the way, the Dresden version is not the version that premiered in Dresden. That's about the third reworking of that version. For example, Venus doesn't appear in the original version at all in Act 3. But he finally got it into the shape that he wanted to, and it still flopped. It didn't help at all. But anyway, and he wanted to change his style once again. He wanted less interruptions, less set numbers, more continual music, some of which in Tannhäuser you already have. You have sort of false harmonic closes and the music goes on and so on. But you can still just stop on the major chord and do it in a concert without, really changing anything except for that one chord. So Lohengrin is a remarkable piece because, for one thing, the libretto that he wrote and sort of the plot that he developed is a tremendous advance on the traditional German legend of Lohengrin. Wagner really kind of tightened that legend up. And ever since, of course, the opera came out, that's the version of the legend that people know, even if they don't go to the opera. So in 1846, after the Tannhäuser flop, he decided to go on vacation, and he went out to this little village called Graupa, where he intended not to have anything to do with music for at least 6 weeks. And he went on a lot of walks. He used to like to hike around in the hills, which always inspired him. And then he started sketching Lohengrin, and he wrote the entire compositional sketch out in this village, which is why a small Wagner Museum was established there over 100 years ago in this kind of dilapidated farmhouse that he was staying at. And
with a tiny bed.
Yes, the bed is yes, you can see how, and they both were sleeping in it, right? Not just him, but Minna as well, right?
Yeah.
Tiny short bed. Yeah. And there was a mayor in the town of Pirna, of which this village is a part of, even though it's essentially between Pirna and Dresden. It's right on the Dresden city border. This mayor decided that there was a building crumbling to pieces in this village, which needed to be restored. It was an old hunting lodge of the royal family, the Wettins, built in the 1700s and completely dilapidated during communist times. One corner of the building had sunk into the ground, and so on and so on. And so after much discussion, this mayor decided, whenever that was, in about 2006 or 7, that there should be an expanded Wagner Museum there. That's what they would do with this building. They would restore it completely using sandstone and the original materials and spending millions of euros, which he managed to organize from all kinds of different funds, EU funds and border funds with Czechoslovakia. And it happened that I'd been lecturing at the technical university. So that's not the music university, that's the technical university, the regular university where musicology is taught. And I've been lecturing there for some years on diverse subjects, also including Wagner. And I gave a special lecture on the Ring at the university and didn't realize that there was this group of people who had been sent there to hear me speak on the subject because they were looking for someone to help them with a new Wagner exhibit. And they came to me afterwards and very cleverly asked me, they didn't say, come and curate this. They said, would you consider helping us? So they roped me in, and that was in the summer of 2009. And so for 3.5 years, I designed this permanent exhibit, which is interactive and multimedia, and it's mostly focused on sound. It's mostly music and also some optical things. There's a virtual orchestra pit, there's some holographic theater scenes. And
let's see if I remember, Rheingold, Dutchman, and
Lohengrin, of course.
And Lohengrin, okay.
Yeah. I mean, they were done in reverse order. I was ordered to do the first one from Lohengrin, naturally. Yeah. And the idea behind the holographic scenes was, since people today, when they go to the opera, see various exotic things happen on stage, I said, this is kind of what Wagner's stage directions say. And let's kind of do that and have some fun with it. But of course, the Rheingold, which I'm very proud of, which we did later, is the transformation scene between scene 2 and 3. And we visualized what the musical motifs were actually representing in that.
That's the scene where Wotan and Loge go down to the Nibelheim and find Alberic and steal the gold.
In order to rob him, yes.
In order to rob him.
But
the anvils are being clinked, and it's a wonderful scene.
The slaves of the anvil, but also thematically, it's one of those very interesting because it's an interlude, it's a scene change music, but it tells a whole story of the interaction between Wotan and Loge, the fire music, and Wotan's kind of renunciation music at the beginning, and then going down, and then of course the themes of the ring and the Rheingold kind of perverted, and then the anvil music and the anvil motif. Anyway, so we had a lot of fun with that, and we opened in 2013 because of the bicentenary of Wagner's birth. But we opened in January because we knew in May all over Germany there was going to be stuff happening. So
and that's where you and I met, because I came in January 2013 because I wanted to see it before the hordes arrived.
Everything wasn't quite in function yet because everything took longer than planned. But yes, that's right. That's when we first met.
Yeah. And you know, my particular interest is a fabulous bakery down the street.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you got to have food. I mean,
so I mean, I would have people go to this museum. I mean, the Lohengrin House, which is where Wagner lived, as you've said, but this museum is really kind of wonderful. It's 6 rooms, because most museums have artifacts. This one, as you said, gets you into the music, and even if you're not a professional, it's beautifully designed to help you understand what Wagner did. And you have a room that's sort of like an enormous machine where you have an orchestra where you can activate the sounds of different instruments and understand how a composer, in this case Wagner, would create his music and what the sounds represent, whether dramatically, in terms of color, emotion, and so on. And it's terrific. And I'm just rushing a bit because, unfortunately, I have places I have to go.
Time is running out. Yeah.
Time is running out. Die Frist ist says one Dutchman. But I mention this because I want, if people don't know Michael's work and all of the activities that you do in Dresden, and not only in terms of education, the next generation of conductors and musicians, helping us find music from the past that is unjustifiably ignored, forgotten, whatever, but also, frankly, being one of the great experts on Richard Wagner and creating an exhibition that permanent, as you said, that is just frankly different from most music museums and very much worth the trip. And then there's a great bakery down the street. So,
and then there's that bakery.
After the exertions of learning all of this music, you got to eat. So,
well, as the people who wrote newspaper articles on the first Bayreuth Festival in 1876 always kept repeating, the main subject in the intervals was the food or the lack of food.
Yeah, of course.
So you got to have good food somewhere. There's no question about that.
But Michael, thank you so much for this visit. I was glad to catch up with you. And I know Adagio listeners, by the way, I want to mention to Adagio listeners that Michael provided quite a list. We want to talk about Bach. That'll be for another time. Puccini, Wagner, understandably, Ray Vaughan Williams, who I adore, César Franck, Giuseppe Verdi, and Ludwig van Beethoven. A wonderful and not necessarily expected list of musical selections. And
very difficult to make only a few selections.
But no, I know. Normally I limit people to 5, but I allowed you to go.
I could. But again, you know, ask me the same question in 2 weeks and you might get a completely different one. But that's just how it is in music.
Well, next time we have a visit like this, I hope in person, I want to go deep on Bach, because because he didn't do opera. I don't know my Bach, though I know my Handel and certain other composers of that era. I mean, obviously I know some Bach, but I'm not at the level I should be.
One sentence about Bach. Albert Schweitzer said that any conductor who did not know and deeply study every single available cantata, which there are, you know, a couple hundred plus, had no business performing any music of Bach's. Because he said most of Bach's music is text related, and therefore the instrumental works are, because of the way he uses themes that he also uses in the cantatas, there's always extra musical context, something that today's musicologists would react in horror, but which I've always loved, because it's also more like what we talked about with opera, the emotions and the specific ideas behind music that you need text for.
Maybe
yeah, we'll save
sometime
that up.
either in Germany or New York or somewhere else, when we can be back in front of audiences together, we'll do a night devoted to Bach. His birthday, if I remember, was in March, so maybe we could do something around a Bach.
We could do something in March, but we can do Bach anytime because
Every Sunday he wrote something new. So
as what some English-speaking audience members might not know, Bach is the German word for stream or brook. And Beethoven famously said his name should not be brook, it should be ocean.
yeah.
So there's plenty to talk about. All right. Well, thank you for inviting
Thank you,
me.
Michael.
It's been delightful.
And I will hope to see you soon.
Take care. Stay healthy.
Thank you.